Imagine for a moment that you are standing in a crowded room, surrounded by the hum of laughter and the rhythmic pulse of shared stories. You wait for a gap in the conversation, a tiny window where you can offer your perspective. You find it, you speak, and for a split second, you feel the rush of connection only to watch as the eyes of your listeners glaze over. Their bodies subtly turn away and someone else cuts across your sentence as if you hadn't spoken at all. This isn't just a social awkwardness. It is a profound, stinging psychological experience that researchers have found triggers the same areas of the brain as physical pain. When we are ignored, our primal brain interprets it as a threat to our survival, a signal that we are being cast out of the tribe. Yet, the most unsettling part of this experience isn't the rejection itself, but the mystery behind it. Why is it that some people command a room with a whisper, while others remain invisible despite their best efforts? The answer rarely lies in your worth as an individual, but rather in a set of deeply ingrained behavioral loops, invisible walls you've built around yourself that prevent your message from ever reaching its destination. To dismantle these walls, we must look beneath the surface of our daily interactions and examine the 5 specific habits that may be silencing your voice before you even open your mouth. At the heart of every successful human interaction is a hidden contract of reciprocity. Think of a conversation as a living, breathing organism that requires a constant exchange of oxygen to survive. When we fall into the habit of the monologue trap, we essentially starve that organism. You might feel that by sharing your stories, your achievements, or your latest struggles, you are being vulnerable and engaging. However, if the I to you ratio is heavily skewed, the brain of the listener begins to shut down. Neuroscience tells us that talking about ourselves triggers the same pleasure centers in the brain as food or money, which makes it an incredibly easy habit to fall into. But for the person listening, a conversation that feels like a one-way street quickly becomes a cognitive burden. If you find that you are constantly waiting for your turn to speak rather than actually listening to what is being said, you are sending a subconscious signal that the other person's reality is less important than your own. People don't just ignore you because they are rude. They ignore you because they feel invisible in your presence. When a listener feels that their input isn't valued, they stop investing their attention. The cure isn't to stop talking about yourself entirely, but to master the curiosity gap. By asking one targeted, genuine question for every story you share, you re-establish that essential balance of power. Relationships are built on the give and take principle, and if you are only taking the spotlight, others will eventually stop shining it on you. This leads us to a more subtle yet equally destructive habit, the role of the constant critic. Perhaps you consider yourself a truth teller or someone who wants the best for their friends and family. You see a mistake, and you point it out. You see a flaw in a plan, and you offer a correction. While your intentions might be rooted in a genuine desire to help, the psychological impact of constant critique is often the opposite of what you intend. Human beings are biologically wired to move toward rewards and away from threats. If your voice becomes synonymous with the threat of judgment or the pain of being corrected, people will instinctively begin to tune you out as a form of self-preservation. This is known as defensive listening. The moment you start to speak, the other person's brain prepares for a critique, effectively closing the gates to genuine connection. If you want your advice to be heard, it must be cushioned within a framework of support. Psychology suggests a positivity ratio, the idea that for every 1 piece of critical feedback, there should be 5 pieces of positive reinforcement. Without this balance, your presence becomes heavy, and people will naturally gravitate toward those who make them feel capable rather than those who make them feel flawed. Measured criticism is a tool for growth, but when it is the only tool in your kit, you will eventually find that you have no one left to build with. Even if you aren't critical, you might be falling victim to the negativity virus. We have all met that person for whom the glass isn't just half empty, it's cracked and leaking. While life is undeniably difficult and everyone needs a place to vent, there is a profound difference between seeking support and becoming a constant source of gloom. In psychology, there is a phenomenon called emotional contagion. Just as we might catch a cold from someone in close proximity, we also catch the moods of those around us. If you consistently focus on what is wrong, the weather, the job, the annoying neighbor, the state of the world, you are projecting a low-frequency energy that others find draining. Over time, people will begin to associate your face and your voice with a feeling of exhaustion. They might not even realize they are doing it, but they will start to invite you to gatherings or miss your calls, simply because their subconscious mind is trying to protect their own emotional well-being. This doesn't mean you have to be a fountain of toxic positivity, but it does mean being mindful of the emotional footprint you leave behind. If your presence consistently lowers the mood of the room, you shouldn't be surprised when people start looking for the exit. Sometimes, however, the barrier isn't the content of your words, but the weight of your presence. Have you ever noticed how some people can enter a room and, without saying a word, command attention? This isn't magic. It's a combination of body language, vocal tonality, and internal confidence. If you struggle with low self-esteem, you might subconsciously try to make yourself smaller to avoid being a target of judgment. You might slump your shoulders, avoid eye contact, or speak in a hesitant, quiet tone. While you might think you are being polite or humble, you are actually sending a nonverbal message that says, "I am not worth listening to." This is the invisibility paradox. By trying to avoid the discomfort of being seen, you create a situation where you are ignored, which then fuels your feeling of worthlessness. Your physical presence is the container for your ideas. If the container looks fragile or hidden, people won't trust the value of what's inside. Building social presence isn't about becoming an extrovert. It's about claiming your space. It's about standing with an open posture and speaking with the assumption that what you have to say has inherent value. When you stop apologizing for your existence, others will stop overlooking it. The final and perhaps most common habit is the silent struggle of the overthinker. If you consider yourself a quiet person in group settings, you likely feel that you are participating because your mind is working at 1,000 miles per hour. You are analyzing the conversation, crafting the perfect response, and waiting for the exact right moment to jump in. But to everyone else, you look like a statue. While you are lost in your internal hurricane of, "What if they think I'm weird?" Or, "Is this the right time to say this?" The conversation has moved on. By the time you've polished your sentence to perfection, the topic is dead. The tragedy of the overthinker is that your silence is often misinterpreted as disinterest, boredom, or even arrogance. People stop looking to you for input because they've assumed you've checked out of the social contract. You feel ignored, but in reality, you never actually showed up to the conversation in the first place. Breaking this habit requires a messy action approach, the willingness to say something imperfect, something simple, or something spontaneous just to stay connected to the flow. The goal of a social interaction isn't to be the smartest person in the room. It's to be the most present person in the room. It is important to remember that none of these habits make you a bad person. In fact, most of them are defense mechanisms we developed to keep ourselves safe from rejection. We talk too much because we want to be liked. We criticize because we want to be helpful. We stay quiet because we don't want to be judged. But these very defenses are often the things that keep us isolated. The journey toward being heard begins with the radical act of self-observation. It's about looking at your social interactions not as a series of personal failures, but as a set of data points. When you start to shift these behaviors, when you listen more than you speak, when you offer praise alongside critique, and when you dare to speak before your thoughts are perfect, you will find that the invisible barrier begins to dissolve. You cannot control how other people react, but you can control the frequency you emit. There is an immense power in realizing that you are the architect of your own social reality. You don't need to change your core personality to be heard. You simply need to clear away the clutter of these 5 habits so that your true voice can finally reach the ears of those who are waiting for it. As you begin to apply these insights and watch the world around, you start to respond differently. You might notice a strange new phenomenon. As the people who used to ignore you suddenly begin to lean in, you'll realize that having someone's attention is a responsibility as much as it is a gift. But this leads to an even more fascinating psychological mystery. Once you've mastered the art of being heard, how do you ensure that you aren't just filling the silence, but actually saying something that will be remembered long after you've left the room? And more importantly, what happens when the very person you've been trying so hard to impress finally sees the real you, the version you've been hiding behind these habits all along?